Okay. Okay, so I think we'll start. Welcome everybody to the Insights presentation this afternoon on the biopsychosocial underpinnings of violence. Sorry, I'm just handwriting people with links to trauma and desistance. My name's Sharon White. I'm one of the national specialist leads for violence in Interventions Services, and I'll be presenting today. And with us is my colleague, Laura Shepherd. And Laura's here helping manage the chat function as we go through the presentation. What will be really helpful is we will hopefully have some time. We'll have some time at the end for some questions. But anything else, any questions you've got that occur to you in the meantime, if you pop them into the chat, that would be great. And Laura will be monitoring that, and we'll try and pick out some of the more themes of questions that might be coming out, or some of the more relevant ones. And we'll answer some of these as well as having some time at the end. So is that okay with you, Laura? Is there anything else you want to add?
No, that's fine. Thank you, Sharon.
Okay, thank you. So welcome everybody. We'll move into the presentation. So I'm sure if you've attended some of the presentations, you'll have seen some of these. Sorry, I've still got people coming in. So just as this is a recorded event, if we could keep, as Laura's asked, cameras and phones, keep on mute and cameras off. Pop the questions into the chat, as we've said, and we will come back and pick up on the questions at the end of the presentation. So for today, just to say, apologies if the screen looks slightly small. The slide you can see, we were having some problems earlier trying to get the slides full size and some of the notes. So hopefully everyone can see everything. If there's something you've missed or you couldn't see on a slide for some reason, the slides will be emailed out along with the notes, but also pop it in the chat and we can come back to it and answer anything that you might not have been able to see. I can see a hand up already at the moment.
Hi, sorry, it's just me. Just wanted to check if everyone can see the chat because I can't see the chat. Just checking if it's enabled.
Oh, let me check mine. I can see chat on mine.
I don't have chat either.
I don't either.
Oh.
Let me work on that then, Sharon, while you continue. I can see chat as well, so I wonder if it's something to do with the settings, but I'll go back on mute and I'll work on it. And otherwise, if people could just save the questions until the end, maybe take a note of them and we'll come back to it. But I might turn my camera off so I can just try and do that and you continue, Sharon. Thank you for raising that.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. And yes, thanks for raising that. We'll carry on. Hopefully we'll get the chat function for all of you, but if not, yes, if you can hold on to your questions, we'll come back to them. So the aims of the workshop today are to look at the biopsychosocial model, provide an understanding of this as the model itself. So I'm just still trying to admit. Explore how the biopsychosocial model can help us understand an individual's reasons for using violence. Look at the potential effects of trauma through a BPS model and look at the links of this to violence. And then I'm going to briefly introduce something called polyvagal theory, which is a newly emerging theory. Just a brief discussion about that to raise that as it links to trauma and violence as well. And then at the end, we're going to look at a trauma-informed approach to supporting desistance. So that's the aims for today. And we'll move straight into the biopsychosocial model. So some of you may be working with or have known about the biopsychosocial model, others may not. So we'll just take this right back from the start. The BPS model is a model to help us explore how our life experiences, anybody's life experiences, help shape how we all develop as individuals and how they influence our thinking, our feelings and our behaviours. So if we look at the slide, the model shows us as in the middle as individual people. And around the outside, it shows three aspects of our lives: biology, psychology, and social influences. So the biopsychosocial helps combine looking at all these three different aspects in each individual, identifying some of the more important aspects that may have had influence over years into the way an individual chooses to behave. And we can link this to using violent behaviours as well, If we take some time with people to talk through their experiences of life and discuss their experiences, it does give us a greater opportunity and them a greater opportunity to understand the factors that have had an impact on them in life, but also to understand in those same spheres, biopsychosocial, their strengths, their skills, their protective factors, everything they've already got in place, and also identify some aspects that they may want to develop as well. So it's a very holistic, comprehensive approach to working with individuals to understand how anyone comes to be who they are in life at any given point. So if we take a deeper look into the BPS model and into those three factors, and we're going to go a little bit more depth as well after this slide. Starting with the biological aspect, under the biological heading, we're really looking at anything that is connected to our genetics, our physiology, or our neurobiology. So it's anything physiological, biological that may have an influence on how someone interacts with the world and experiences the world and those influences on them. So we would look at, when we're discussing this with somebody, we might look at whether an individual has ADHD, whether they have autism, whether they have learning difficulties, might have obsessive compulsive disorders. We might look at neurobiology, which is just the way our brains work and lead us to behaving in certain ways. In terms of looking at individuals in particular who use violence, we would inquire about whether somebody's had a brain injury, acquired or traumatic brain injury, and we'll talk a bit more about that later on. We would also look at any influence or experiences of trauma in somebody's life, adverse childhood experiences, which again we'll mention a little bit later on. And under the biological aspect, again, we'll come to look at the theory, polyvagal theory, which is how our autonomic nervous system works inside us to keep us safe at all times. So there's some of the factors we would look at underneath the biological aspect of the model. Psychological, from the psychological perspective, there's a range of factors attend in psychology, but we would look at attachment experiences, early learning experiences, experiences of care, of safeness, the presence or absence of emotionally connected individuals and adults in somebody's life, how that's affected somebody. We would look at social learning in terms of social learning theory suggests that as humans, we learn through experiences that have happened directly to us or that we've observed in the world around us. And from those experiences, we come to form ways of thinking, ways of feeling, attitudes, beliefs, values, and we have memories all linked to those experiences that we've had that have now formed our patterns of thinking and our patterns of belief in the way we work. I don't know if you can see the picture, but there's a small picture there with a balloon and some clouds in it. And from a psychological aspect, it's a CBT, REBT saying that it says that we see the world really not as it is, but as we are. So as we're born and we get our experiences and we go through life, we come to form our attitudes, our values, our thinking and our beliefs. And therefore, when we encounter the world and situations in the world, we see those experiences through our own personal psychological lens. We interpret them our own way, not necessarily as the facts of the world are, but through our own lens. And it's what every single human will do. We all do it. So again, moving on to the model in terms of social factors. The social aspect of the biopsychosocial model pays attention to how our everyday social experiences we have shaped how we live our lives. Now, these social experiences will occur from birth right up until the present day and will keep occurring as we go through life. It includes looking at things such as education, employment, cultural influences, religious influences, our community around us, the neighbourhoods we live in, socioeconomic status. It's also things like absorbing messages through society, through radio, books, newspapers, phones, mobile phones, apps, all of this. Importantly, one of the aspects we look at, and again, especially with the people we work with who might have used violence, we look at peer groups, peer group influence, peer group factors, and we look at generally the social experiences somebody might have had within their family and friends and may still be having within their family and friends network. So you can see that there's a whole holistic approach looking at a range of factors. Obviously we wouldn't cover all of these with everyone, but we would have discussions and ongoing discussions about particular aspects that an individual may feel stand out for them in their life and may have had an influence on the way they think now and how they choose to behave. So if we move on through to look in a little bit more depth, thinking about the BPS model, so the biological, social and psychological factors, if we think about these now in terms of how some of these factors may influence somebody to use or to think about using aggression or violence. So from a biological lens, we might be looking at, as we've said before, mentioned genetics, and we'd also, some people might look at neurotransmitter levels in an individual, which I'll come on to in a second. In terms of biology, we again have mentioned we would look at acquired brain injury, traumatic brain injury. This is traumatic brain injury. Research has shown us that in individuals within HMPPS, individuals who have convictions of violence it's 40 to 60% of them, if not slightly higher, have had some kind of traumatic brain injury within their lifetime. So we know that TBI, traumatic brain injury, is a high incidence within those who use violence. And the effects of this they're numerous, but there's many effects with difficulty in focusing, attention, deficits in planning and decision making, reduced emotional understanding and emotional or impulse control, difficulties in thinking flexibly, calmly, reasonably, and therefore increased aggression. When we combine the difficulty managing emotions and the difficulty thinking, there's a tendency for increased aggression, and particularly impulsive aggression following a traumatic brain injury. So again, it's very helpful for us and for the individual to understand whether they've had some kind of injury to their head. This could be anything, just one punch or a fight or a fall over. It's very important to try and understand if this has affected them. Also, under the biological aspect, and we may not know about any of this, but it's relevant, there could be damage to the amygdala. This can happen either through brain injury or it can happen through trauma and stress in the early years of life. And what happens is the ongoing trauma and the ongoing stress serves to not allow our amygdalas to function fully and to become fully developed and fully grown. Therefore, what happens is there is reduced ability for conflict management. So we're trying to get his earmuffs off. Reduced ability for conflict management and a tendency to use increased aggression to manage conflict. Again, coming back to neurotransmitters, we know research has shown as evidence that lower levels of serotonin have been associated with aggression, impulsivity, and studies have shown that for those who use repeated violence or severe violence, blood tests have often shown that there are lower levels of serotonin in these individuals. Again, through a biological lens, we'd be looking at trauma, any experiences of trauma, the age this happened, the impact that what kind of trauma it was. But within reason, we will only discuss where an individual is happy and feels safe to discuss and to go there. And again, within biological lens, we might look at polyvagal theory, but we'll come on to that a little bit later. So again, now thinking about through the psychological lens, how might some of the factors that we look at through the psychological lens have an influence on somebody developing or using aggression or violence behaviours? So we know that our learned history, which is all the experiences we've had from birth right up until the present day, will shape the way we think, the way we feel, and our attitudes, beliefs and values. Many studies have shown exposure to violence or exposure to neglect leads to the developments of attitudes and beliefs about violence being acceptable and normal. So when young children or young adults have been exposed to violence or exposed to neglect, and again, trauma would come into that. Belief systems can develop to protect themselves. An individual may develop beliefs that to protect themselves, to ensure that they come to see violence as normal, acceptable part of life, just as what we do. And we know that the more a child or a young adult or anybody believes that these behaviours are acceptable, then the more likely they are to use them and to continue using them and not to question them. From a psychological aspect as well, exposure to violence and neglect helps to develop distortions in an individual's ability to understand social cues. So to go into a social situation, they may find it difficult to accurately perceive what's happening in that social situation. They may jump to conclusions and to reach the wrong conclusions about aggression and hostility in a social situation that's not actually present, but their life view of the world has enabled distortions to occur that then influence the way most social situations are looked at and viewed as aggressive rather than ambiguous or non-aggressive. From this, what happens is that an individual can develop what we call hostile attributions, which is where someone may go through life having developed suspicious and feeling hostile towards people, untrusting, very suspicious, and believing that behaviours that are done to them or around them are specifically and intentionally against them. So they attribute anything that happens in life as negative towards themselves, but being done deliberately by somebody else to them. Also within the psychological aspect, we look at schemas and scripts, which are patterns of behaviours that somebody might have formed. So what patterns and themes and repeated behaviours involving the use of violence has an individual come to use to protect themselves, to defend themselves, whatever the reasons are, but these are now automatic scripts and patterns of behaviours that someone will turn to instinctively and begin to use violence. We do know that lack of secure attachments in childhood can lead to feelings of abandonment and therefore lead to an individual becoming hypervigilant to rejection, to abandonment, to threat, to feeling unsafe. And these feelings lead to anger within life generally. We also know that grievance and hostility problems through research has shown to persist in people who have had attachment problems. So there's a number of aspects that we can explore with someone through a psychological lens as to how their experiences in life have led them to formulate thinking, feelings, attitudes and beliefs that lead to violent behaviours. Moving on to look at violent behaviours developing through the social experience lens. We know that violence and aggression is a learned behaviour. It's experienced through observing aggressive behaviours in social contexts or having aggressive behaviour, directly experiencing aggressive behaviours. This can happen in a range of social contexts, and once this happens, the behaviour becomes normalised. So for that particular context, the use of violence becomes very, very quickly normalised and part of life. This can be through experiencing it or observing it through parents, siblings, friends, school, socialising, and the media is now a major factor in social context of violence. The use of media, use of phones, observing violence, witnessing violence, recording violence, a whole range of things where media is now a heavy influence within the use of violence occurring. We also understand that there are influences from social, from cultural, religious and socioeconomic status, or any of those social factors can provide messages and influence people towards the development of the use of violence and development of deep-seated attitudes towards violence. Grievance and hostile rumination is often socially influenced. For example, children can observe revenge behaviours displayed by significant others, parents, siblings, people they look up to, friends. So when they observe revenge behaviours working to help that person get what they want, the child may then take on those grievance and hostile behaviours as well. And also looking at the use of aggression and violence through a social lens, one of the important aspects is in understanding that as human beings, we all need to be part of something. We need connection to other people, and we need to feel that we're part of something. So peer influence, peer pressure, peer influence is a major part of the social influence that can influence the use of violence. Studies have shown that in young adults, most violent offences up to the late teenage years are committed in groups with more than one person at least. After the age of 20, many violent offences are committed by people on their own. So we know that for young adults, the use of violence and peer pressure is very heavily linked. And also other studies have shown that the need to be connected, to be part of a group, has shown that for young adults, again, especially, belonging to that group and accepting the norms of that group, even if that includes violence, is more important to them than to be able to move away from the group by themselves and not use violence. So again, a range of factors and experiences through the social lens that we would just explore with an individual, helping them and us to understand how they've influenced their life to date. And from this, how we might help them develop further strengths, skills and protective factors to move away from some of these influences. But overall, if we think about our BPS, our biological, psychological and social influences, when we're born, none of us choose, and we don't choose the biopsychosocial circumstances that make us who we are. We can't choose what family we were born into, what country, what lifestyle. We don't have a choice in any of that. So we don't choose them. But as people go through life, each of their life experiences that they were born into and that they do experience are very unique to them and very important to contributing to how an individual evolves in life. So an awareness of the biopsychosocial experiences is key to understanding the behaviours people use. So why do some people use violence and some people don't? Why might some people have certain strengths and skills and others haven't? Why might some people be able to desist from violence slightly easier and others find it very, very difficult? And also the use of the BPS model is hugely important in helping us develop strong therapeutic relationships by understanding the difficulties and the experience that an individual has been through, being able to empathise and to validate the difficulties of some of these experiences, and therefore to enable them to trust and to open up and to develop that trusting, open, strong, supportive relationship. By using our understanding and awareness of the experiences of their BPS experiences, we can help them move towards positive change. So moving on from still using the BPS model, if we move into look a bit more about trauma. And how does trauma link to violence? Excuse me. So trauma has been defined as either a major event, or it can be a series of ongoing negative events, stressful events, difficult events. It doesn't have to be one major event for anybody. It can be a lifetime of little events that happen or progressive, continual series of events. Trauma is said to be when an external threat or external situations are so great that they overwhelm that person's ability to use their positive coping mechanisms anymore. We also know that many children are exposed to what we call adverse childhood experiences. And these could be difficulties in the family, growing up with a family where they're exposed to violence, neglect, lack of emotional support, sometimes growing up in the families where alcohol is a big factor or drug use. Adverse childhood experience, we know now that greater than four or over are very clearly linked in individuals who use violence. in the research. And from this, these individuals tend to grow up developing very self-protective, violent, supportive beliefs to cope with life and to cope with managing through these adverse events. So in terms of trauma and its effect on the brain and how it may influence some of the behaviours we see in individuals who use violence, trauma has a number of effects on the brain. So in the prefrontal cortex at the front of the brain, when trauma occurs, it can affect things like empathy. So we see that individuals who use violence often have difficulty in empathising with other people and feeling empathy for others. Often a lack of insight into their own behaviours, their reasons for their behaviours or what they're doing. Difficulty with flexibility in their responses and flexibility of thinking, able to generate different options of behaviours. Difficulties with emotion regulation, with controlling their body responses. Often there are difficulties with moral issues, understanding and accepting the generalised morality in society, moral codes. Difficulties with understanding their own intuition, understanding themselves or other people, or reading the room, reading the environment, reading the circumstances. Difficulties with communication, and also great difficulties in their management of their own fear and their own fear responses. In terms of the limbic brain, so traumatic brain injuries or trauma itself will also affect not only the frontal cortex that we've just been talking about, those functions, it will also affect the limbic brain, which is our emotional centre. And this is where we have our fight, flight, freeze and stress responses. So it affects the regulation of these and often leaves people feeling very hypervigilant of threat, but thinking, am I safe? Do people still want me? Should I be here? Is this a safe place for me to be? Very high emotions, very difficult management of all this. So we can see that trauma has the potential to have a large effect on a number of areas for an individual, and the earlier that somebody experiences trauma, the earlier in childhood, the greater these effects and the more intense and ongoing the effects are through young adult into adulthood. This slide here is a general overview to try to highlight the differences between an individual who has been exposed to trauma and one who hasn't been exposed to trauma, and the links to how this may help us understand how violent behaviours can become much more predominant in those who've had trauma. So on the left, we've got the section with typical development, where someone not exposed to trauma at the bottom will have initially needs to survive. So that will be food, warmth, roof over your head, connection with other people, basic survival needs that we all have. As they grow older and evolve, children learn how to regulate themselves, how to regulate their body, how to regulate their behaviours, and this is all part of growing up and learning how to be in the world, how to connect with people and how to interact. Then comes the social and emotional development, where emotions are begun to understood what they are, how they influence us, how people might react to emotions, what's appropriate, what's not appropriate. And then moving into cognitive development at the higher end of the scale as we grow older, with children and individuals learning how to think, how to reason, how to be logical, how to be flexible in thinking and generate options. So that's a development, generalized development of somebody not exposed to trauma. For those individuals who have been exposed to developmental trauma, on the other diagram here, we can see the triangle is upside down. And for these individuals, because of the trauma and because of the effects on the development of the brain from this trauma, the major predominant instinct for a child who's experienced trauma and grown into a young adult and into an adult, their main mode in life is to continue focusing on pure survival, just to survive, to get through each day, to get through life. And survival will be attained in any method they know, and probably the only methods they know, and that will involve violence a lot of the time. There is some, learning some kind of regulation of our body, regulation of how to interact and how to be, but not on the same level. There's a reduced understanding of social and emotional regulation, so interpreting situations, understanding emotions, understanding their own emotions, or interpreting other people's emotions is greatly reduced. And right at the top we can see there's much less development of cognitions, how to think, how to reason, how to be flexible in our thinking, what's appropriate types of thinking and behaviours and what's not helpful. So we can see that those who've been exposed to trauma are in survival mode, really, still for most of the time. But these are all internal. This affects us internally. And so what we will see is just a normal person on the outside, but probably with a range of violent behaviours because of that survival instinct, survival mode. So pulling it together and thinking about trauma and violence as a whole through a biopsychosocial lens, we know that trauma overwhelms our physical and psychological systems. Trauma is stored in the body and not just in the mind. And by that we mean that trauma clearly is stored in our memories, our attitudes, our thinking, our feelings, we know that. But also trauma is stored at a cellular level within the body. Every cell in the body, once it's being exposed to trauma, is sensitive to the next traumatic experience coming in and is ready to defend the body against trauma. We know that the body responds before the mind a lot of the time because we can sense our body changes in all sorts of situations. So if we are anxious, we'll tend to feel it in the body, in our chest, in our stomach. We might feel shaky. We feel anxiety in our body, even if we don't necessarily, at a cognitive level, understand what the anxiety is about. If we feel happy in our bodies, our whole bodies can feel happy and calm and relaxed, even without a specific trigger or point at that time. So we know the same for trauma. Trauma is stored in the body cells all through the body, not just in our mind and in our memories. So thinking about the aggression responses in relation to trauma from the BPS model, on the biological aspect, we have the fight, flight, or freeze, or numbing, which we'll come on to in a second, shut down numbing processes from a biological perspective in response to trauma. But often the most prominent sign that we will see from a biological perspective in relation to use of violence or aggression is an individual who is hypervigilant, looking for threat the whole time. They don't know they're doing it. It's an unconscious process, but they're very vigilant to threat and respond very quickly. They're highly aroused and respond quickly to any perceived threat in the world around them. From a psychological perspective, those that have been experienced a trauma and use violence, we know that they've developed protective violence supporting belief mechanisms, but these genuinely come from a place of trying to keep themselves safe in the world. They've learnt to develop hostile thinking. There's often personality changes and changes in identity, and through that we're looking at changes may be associated with masculinity, identifying as the tough man, status, reputation, control, anything that gives them the status and the feeling that I'm in charge, get in there first, no one puts me down. So changes in identity are often related to that perception of a masculine, in control, in charge man who will get in first rather than be attacked. And then changes in the social aspect are people can dissociate following trauma and depression and anxiety and pull away. But we also know that in terms of violence, hostile people will deal with social situations in a hostile manner rather than an appropriate manner, will often be suspicious, defensive, retaliatory and argumentative in a range of social settings. So trauma can end up leading with harm to self in terms of substance abuse, eating disorders and self-harm. We also know that trauma-related substance abuse is also linked to maintenance of violence, as alcohol use and drug use and violence are very interlinked and related in these situations. But trauma and violence are also linked in harm to others through the use of aggression, violence, hostility, rages and vengeance and distrust. So when we're pulling together the biopsychosocial model, looking at it as a whole and considering trauma in those who've used violence, we can begin to see how understanding these factors can help us work with and move forward, help an individual understand how they've got to the place they are now. Have I got feedback? Sorry. I'm aware of time, so we'll move through this so we can hopefully have some questions at the end. We're going to quickly look at polyvagal theory, which is a newer theory coming out, emerging. It's not a proven theory yet. It's definitely still a theory, but it's a theory linked to understanding again how trauma can affect our body responses and how trauma can influence our body to protect us and become defensive in life, which can then lead to using violence. So before we look at polyvagal theory, I'm just going to ask you all to have a think for a second. I want you to think about times in your life, if you've ever been in a situation, walked into a situation where you yourself felt uncertain or in danger. So you might not, at that time, you might not have felt really sure why you felt like that. You might have looked around, looked at other people and thought, no one else seems to be bothered. No one else looks uncomfortable here. But for you, yourself, something still feels off to you or uncertain about this situation. So we might call these our instinctive responses. And this is because we are walking around the world each day with our bodies and our brains taking on board hundreds of social cues from all our environments all over the place. It's part of being human, it's part of our human experience. As we've had this from childhood and going through childhood, young adults to adults, these experiences that we've had about these situations, we learn to develop our sense of self, and we learn to develop an understanding of who we can trust, what feels dangerous, what doesn't feel dangerous, what situations feel dangerous and what doesn't. So polyvagal theory draws all of this together in this new theory to help provide an understanding of how our mind and body work together in response to the social cues that we all have every day of our life. It's an understanding of how our autonomic nervous system shapes the way our body experiences and responds to the experiences of daily living, with the aim being of keeping us safe every day. So we'll move on to move it in a little bit more detail. Polyvagal theory is a theory about our evolutionary mechanisms, basically saying that our bodies, our brains and our bodies still work today, currently today, in the way they've always worked way back a few years ago. So it's an evolutionary process. Our autonomic nervous system in our body is constantly scanning our environment, and it has done since years and years ago. Constantly scans our environment for signs of threat and danger and for signs of safety every single day. This is an automatic, unconscious process that we are not aware of is happening at the time, but is continually happening. So years ago, people might be afraid of threats from tigers or perhaps the woolly mammoth. And in the current day, we're no longer afraid of threats of tigers or woolly mammoths, but the modern day stressful threat situations still occur in all of our lives, and our bodies will still react to them in the same way. And our bodies will often react to threat situations before our minds have actually fully registered what's happening or what to do. So when a threat is detected by our body, whether it's real or perceived, our body tries to defend us in a few different ways. It can either fight, flight or freeze, which we'll come on to talk about in a second. But when it's trying to defend us with a fight, flight and freeze, the aim is to always return us to the body and the mind feeling a state of safety. So we'll look a bit more at what we mean by these different protective mechanisms, and then we'll look at how these might link to use of violence. So our nervous system has 3 automatic protective states. The red state is what we call the life-threatening state, and this is the earliest evolutionary protective state that we know about. So this is mammalians and higher mammals, but it also goes back to the reptiles, which, if you can see in the picture here, I think that's a possum. So when a mammal or a reptile experiences an extreme threat, one that would seem to be life-threatening and that the individual can't cope with, the body will shut down all the major functioning systems in our body to preserve energy for that, well, for the animal or for the human. So if an individual can't run away, or an animal can't fight and can't flight, can't run away, the body will close it down to reduce the blood pressure, reduce the oxygen, reduce the heart rate, reduce energy expenditure, all of these things to allow A, survival to be maintained for as long as possible, and B, years ago, if a possum was being chased as a food substance for somebody, if he couldn't run away fast enough and couldn't get away, the body was shut down, the possum plays dead, lies on the ground, and the predator thinks, dead animal, dirty meat, old meat, not going to try with that, doesn't chase it anymore. In current day, our shutdown state still occurs where people have been known to, when they've been attacked or been in violent situations or difficult situations, traumatic responses such as, why didn't I fight? Why didn't I resist? Why did I let that happen to me? I felt powerless, I couldn't do anything. That is a completely normal response that they had no control over. It was the body's response to an extreme threat. It shuts down the body, shuts down the brain, and the individual is not able to do anything further other than to survive at that point. The next state is the amber state, which is where we might detect a threat in our world, and our body then releases adrenaline and puts us into the fight-flight mode. If a threat is detected, the first thing we try to do is to flight, run away, find safety, go and escape from this. If we can't, we may turn to try to fight the threat away. In many of our individuals that we've worked with that use violence, they no longer use the flight, but often it's the fight mode. Threats detected, fight. So the emotions associated with this are anxiety, distress, stress, agitated, anger, rage, a whole range of emotions that occur when adrenaline is released into the body. But again, fight-flight is our autonomic system trying to protect us against a potential threat. So, having thought for years there was only 2 systems, it's now emerging over recent years that there's a third system that our bodies tend to work in, and this is called the green state, the social engagement system. And this is where we're in a situation where we feel connected to other people, our emotional systems are calm, we feel engaged with other people, we're happy and we're relaxed. We can go to work, we can go to school, we can have relationships, and we can engage because we don't feel anywhere in a state of threat. Our bodies are detecting no threat around us and keep us in an engaged situation so that relationships can progress and life can progress. So they're the 3 main states proposed within polyvagal theory. This is all well and good that this is an automatic process, because if we think about a life-threatening state, if we were, if this makes sense to us, if we were in the Serengeti and confronted by a hungry tiger, if we had to stop and think, if we engaged our brains and had to stop and think about the level of danger we were in, we would already be dead. So the fact is, our body has already sensed the danger and has already put us into either fight, flight or freeze mode to protect us. We can also translate this process into meeting other people in our social world. We might come across people, this is where I was saying to you, think about situations where you might have felt uncomfortable before, not quite sure why. when we meet people in social situations, if that individual gives off signals of safety, which are, a smile, eye contact, relaxed body language, posture, we generally will feel safe in their presence, safe and comfortable, and we will engage with them and we can develop that relationship or enjoy that social situation. That's our safe state. However, at times we may enter social situations where we've chosen Hannibal Lecter here, where we may perceive or come across an individual that doesn't give us a sense of safety. Something inside our body detects a threat from that individual, but we don't necessarily know why. A sixth sense, an intuition. Sometimes some of the clues might be in the face. So as we can see from Hannibal here, a flat face, no smiling, coldness behind the eyes, tense body, posture, a range of signals that may indicate I'm not in a safe place. I need to have my fight or flight up because I may need to exit this situation. But again, because this is all at an unconscious level, we don't always know what's going on inside us. It just feels like a sixth sense and understanding whether something's safe or whether it's not safe. In terms of everyday of people who haven't been exposed to trauma, we would expect people to be moving regularly during the day between feeling safe, occasionally feeling a little bit of threat, maybe a disagreement with someone, an odd look from somebody else, a feeling of things aren't quite right. That might be a little bit of a threat situation, and then moving swiftly back into feeling safe. So this happens throughout the day, and we would call this resilience, when somebody is able to monitor a situation and move between safe and threat. However, for those people that have been impacted by trauma and had traumatic experiences, their nervous systems are very much more hypervigilant to threat. Their nervous system has been reset. It's now no longer the original system they were born with, and it's much more prone and sensitive to threat. So these individuals often spend their day, much of the day, moving between perceiving a situation as life-threatening and intense to just a threat, to life-threatening to just a threat. There's very little sense of a green state of calm and a non-threatening state, because most situations are perceived incorrectly, or sometimes correctly, as threatening when they're not actually at all. So we know that people who have been exposed to trauma and people who use violence through this occurs because of this system, the threat system. They perceive ambiguous stimuli as potentially threatening and hostile. They respond automatically from a very aggressive defensive position, unable to understand other people's emotions or their own, and a much reduced ability to think or reason or discuss. So the people in these situations with this response system, it's aggress first, use aggression, think later. So finally, as we come towards the end of this now, just to say the effects of trauma on everyday behaviours, pulling this all together, people have trauma and use violence. They may experience constant hypervigilance to threat, inability to interpret ambiguous stimuli as non-threatening, inability to recognise their own or other emotional states, often developing maladaptive coping mechanisms, often substance use or use of violence, tend to have a very negative worldview, and that they get their needs met the only way they know how, through these protective attitudes and beliefs that lead them to using violence. And they have a difficulty with trust and reduced ability to communicate. So as practitioners, what do we need to do? We need to consider how we work with these individuals in a trauma-informed way. So one of the major things that we would try to focus on as practitioners, whether it's in a group setting or whether it's in an individual work, is to establish a sense of safety for all contacts with that individual. We need to try to create messages to them through our body and our posture and our tone of voice and everything we use to convey signals of safety to that individual, so rather than signals of threat. The main aim of our work is to form safe relationships and safe environments for these individuals. Trustworthiness. That involves us as practitioners looking for empathy for the life experience, hearing through the BPS model some of the difficult experience they've had and validating how difficult that must have been for that individual, acknowledging that was real and that was difficult. From this acknowledgement and validation, we can work towards building up trust and openness. Collaboration, we work collaboratively, aiming to develop genuine supportive therapeutic relationships. Choice, we know from the research that choice is an important factor in reducing desistance for general violent offending. Trying to offer choice and control where possible within professional boundaries, and trying to encourage change through positive choices of behaviours. And then finally, empowerment. Again, one of the desistance research has shown one of the factors to reducing violence both in prisons and in the community is to help somebody build autonomy and strengths and resilience. And that means us trying to understand their BPS factors that lead them to violence, and then to develop safe environments, safe spaces, safe connection with them to help them move through this and begin to feel empowered and autonomous. And the final focus is that overall, when dealing with individuals who use violence, we need to look at a shift in perspective when we can, from what's wrong with you, why do you use violence, what's that all about, to what has happened to you. Shift the focus from the risk and the deficits to focus on trying to build safety in their world and in their minds and autonomy. So how can we help you? What are your values? How can we reconnect with your values, strengths and skills and protective factors? And what do you feel can be added to your life that could help bring you safety, health, happiness and positive relationships? So the whole focus to shift from what's wrong with you to what has happened to you, and how can we help you with that understanding move towards the future. And from that point, last but not least, I'll try my best. Any questions, I'll try my best to answer them. And if I can't answer them, we will find the answers and send them out with the slides and information. But thank you for your attention and participation. So we've got a few minutes left. We've got 5 minutes left at the moment, and I'm happy to stay on for a little bit longer if anybody has any questions. Laura, did we manage to sort out the chat?
No, gosh, sorry. Right. Just got to apologise and explain that it's a setting in Teams that we've not got the function to change. So unfortunately I can't activate chat, so we'll just have to take questions if people want to put their hands up, Sharon, and then we can just go to people in turn. Maybe if people want to put the cameras back on, if you've got that functionality as well while Sharon's taking questions. If you have got a question to ask, it'd be nice to see people's faces as well, but obviously if you don't feel comfortable to do that, then that's fine as well.
Thank you, Laura, that's great. I can see some hands up. I can't see everyone, so we might have to. Laura, can you see? I can see.
Yeah, Jackie Wilson has got her hand up.
Thank you.
Hi. Yeah, thanks, Sharon. That was a very interesting talk and really valuable information that you've kind of sort of imparted. I think one of the things that I work in a prison, and I think one of the things that I find increasingly frustrated, I think, under the biopsychosocial model, the issues around the psychological and the social are probably easier. I'm not saying they're simple, but they're probably easier to identify. The issues around the biological aspects are a lot more difficult, and particularly in trying to get funding. So I'll give you an example. We had a prisoner, an IPP prisoner, who was 10 years over tariff. It only came out at his, I can't remember how many parole reviews he had, but he had quite a lot. But really at the last parole review that we had for him before he got released, that he actually had frontal brain lobe damage. Now, that only came about because of his solicitor, and because she was able to fund a specialist to come in and do an assessment for him. And I guess for me, I think we probably have a lot of people in the prison who have got some impairments, some difficulties in terms of their brain functioning, and it's incredibly difficult, one, to get the assessments done, and two, to get funding for those assessments. I mean, is there anything that we can do about that?
Gosh, that's that's a huge question, and one that I think lots of that has been asked more and more recently. I think in terms of the system as a whole, we obviously don't have that much input into what assessments can be conducted and what's not. But I think in terms of traumatic brain injury, there is a recognition within HMPPS that this is a major factor in many, like you said, in many of the people we work with and that are in our care. So I think it's something that's being considered within developments in assessment processes. Do we, and if we can, how do we incorporate assessments for things like traumatic brain injury? So I know it is being considered. It's definitely up in the discussion processes at the moment. How that evolves, I don't think anybody's quite sure at the moment, but it's definitely known about. There's an awareness of it and an awareness of the need to begin to understand who in our care does have difficulties because of injuries such as these. There are questionnaires out there, there are screening tools, screening instruments that are used in the health service, and I think actually within some prisons. But I think there needs to be like a national, it will need to evolve as a national strategy for how do we detect and assess for these individuals, and therefore how do we help them, how do we work with them. But at the moment it's early stages, but it's definitely on the radar.
Okay, thank you.
I can't see anybody else with the hands up, Sharon. I don't know if anyone else has got a question. If you either want to put your hand up, or if you've not got the function to do that, then please turn your camera on. So I can see that there's a question from Mel. Sharon.
Hi, just a dead straightforward one. I wondered if you were emailing the slides afterwards, or if not, could you, so it's something to refer back to.
Sorry, I meant to share
the slides, the presentation. Sorry.
Yes, they will be shared, definitely. The slides and the notes will be shared. Yeah.
Thank you.
No problem.
Natalie Fisher's next, Sharon, with a question.
Hi, just a quick one. Obviously Resolve's been decommissioned now, and I just wondered whether there's anything that is going to replace Resolve, or a programme that's going to be proposed that's going to cover some of the topics that you've spoke about this afternoon.
Oh, sorry, I've come off mute. At the moment, Resolve, the men who were going on to Resolve are assessed and going on to TSP if they're suitable. We are aware that there are some men who would have met the Resolve criteria that don't meet the TSP criteria at the moment. And as far as I'm aware, that each individual area has plans in place for helping both probation and prison service for helping meet the needs of those men. In terms of programmes, all programmes are under constant review. But at the moment, we've currently got the suite of programmes that we've got, but with reviews being undertaken as to what might be developments for the future. If that helps at all. So I'd say it's the long and short. At the moment, nothing is coming in to replace Resolve. We have programmes that we have, but I would say that programmes are under continual review, and the suite is always being reviewed for what the needs are, and will be always continually reviewed and adapted as we go along.
Thanks, Sharon.
Thank you. Any other questions from anyone? That was a lot of information to take in, so in an hour. So I will send the slides out, and you can have a look at it a bit more slowly in your leisure.
I can't see any more hands up, Sharon.
No. Do always feel free to email if you have a question or anything you want to ask. That's absolutely fine. I'm always happy to answer questions. Okay. On that case, thank you for attending. Hope it was helpful, and we will send out the slides and the notes as well as soon as possible. They'll probably come out from our business team. Thank you. Thank you for the love hearts. That means I'm feeling in a safe space now. Thank you.